I never thought I'd tell this story to anyone. But 3 weeks ago, my daughter sent me one of your videos. Something about a woman who lost everything but found Jesus in her darkest hour. I watched it at 2 a.m., alone in my kitchen, and I couldn't stop crying. For the first time in years, I felt like someone might understand what happened to me, what I saw, what touched me when I was supposed to die. I was lying in that hospital bed, machines beeping around me like angry wasps. The fluorescent lights above flickered, on, off, casting shadows that danced across the white ceiling. My chest felt like someone had placed a burning coal inside it. Each breath was a struggle, each heartbeat an earthquake in my ribs. The doctors were shouting in Arabic, their voices echoing down the sterile corridor. "We're losing him," I heard someone say. "His heart can't take much more." I could feel my body growing cold from the edges inward, my fingertips first, then my hands, then my arms. The pain in my chest was fading, but not in a good way. It was fading because everything was fading. I tried to call out for my wife, for my son, but no sound came. The monitor beside me was screaming now, that long, terrible beep that means everything is ending. But then I felt it. A warmth spreading across my chest, gentle as a mother's hand on a fevered forehead. Someone was there. I couldn't see them, but I felt their presence like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The chaos around me seemed to slow. The shouting became distant, and for just a moment, there was perfect peace in that room of dying. I was an imam. For 37 years, I had stood before congregations and spoken of Allah's will, of submission, of the straight path that leads to paradise. I wore the white robes of righteousness, led prayers at dawn and dusk, guided young men in their faith. I thought I knew everything about God, about heaven, about who was worthy of salvation. I was wrong about everything. The mosque where I grew up stood like a fortress of faith on the corner of our street in Algiers. Its white minaret reached toward heaven, calling the faithful 5 times a day, with a voice that echoed off the surrounding buildings. My father was the imam there, as his father had been before him, and his father before that. Our family name was carved in stone above the entrance. We were the keepers of this sacred space, the guardians of tradition. I was 5 years old when I first walked those marble floors, my small bare feet slapping against the cool stone as I followed my father through his morning routine. He would move through the empty prayer hall like a ghost, straightening prayer rugs, adjusting the mihrab, checking that everything was perfect for the day's worshippers. "This is your inheritance," he would tell me, his voice soft but firm. Not money, not land, but something far more precious, the trust of Allah's people. The walls of our house were lined with religious texts, their Arabic calligraphy flowing like rivers of black ink across yellowed pages. My mother would point to them and say, "These books contain all the truth you will ever need. Everything outside these walls is confusion, temptation, lies." I learned to read before I learned to question, memorizing verses that filled my mouth like honey, but sometimes sat heavy in my stomach. By the time I was 12, I could recite half the Quran from memory. The elders would pat my head and call me a blessed child, the future of our community. But even then, sitting cross-legged on those prayer rugs, I felt something stirring inside me that I couldn't name. When they spoke of Isa, Jesus, as merely a prophet, something in my chest would flutter like a trapped bird. I pushed those feelings down, buried them beneath layers of memorized prayers and inherited certainty. Doubt is the beginning of spiritual death, my father would say when I was old enough to understand. The moment you question what has been revealed, you open your heart to the whispers of evil. Better to die with faith than live with uncertainty. I nodded and agreed, but late at night, staring at the ceiling of my small room, I would wonder what it meant to truly know God, not just know about Him. The community expected greatness from me. I was enrolled in the finest Islamic schools, tutored by respected scholars, groomed to take my father's place. Every Friday, I would stand beside him as he delivered his sermon, watching the faces of the faithful as they hung on his every word. They looked at him with such reverence, such complete trust. Would they look at me the same way someday? Did I want them to? Sheikh Ahmad arrived at our mosque when I turned 16, sent by the religious council to strengthen the youth in their convictions. He was a man carved from stone and shadow, with eyes that seemed to look straight through to your soul and find it wanting. His beard was perfectly groomed, his robes spotless white, his voice like thunder rolling across desert hills. From the first day, he singled me out. "You are soft," he told me, after watching me lead a prayer session with younger boys. "Your father has made you comfortable, but comfort is the enemy of faith. In my country, boys your age die for their beliefs. Here, you question whether the water for ablution is too cold." His words stung because they carried truth. I had been raised in relative ease, protected from the harsh realities that shaped faith in harder places. He instituted new rules, new disciplines. We would wake before dawn for additional prayers, fast on days beyond Ramadan, memorize not just the beautiful verses, but the difficult ones, the ones about warfare, about the fate of unbelievers, about the sword of righteousness. "Faith without teeth is not faith," he would say. "It is merely wishful thinking dressed in holy clothes." One afternoon, as we studied in the small room behind the main prayer hall, I dared to ask about a verse that had been troubling me. It spoke of showing no mercy to those who rejected the message, of fighting until all opposition was crushed. "Sheikh," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "what if someone's heart tells them to show compassion even to those who don't believe as we do?" The silence that followed felt like the air before lightning strikes. Sheikh Ahmad closed his book slowly, the sound echoing like a door slamming shut. He stood and walked to where I sat, his shadow falling across my open Quran. "Your heart," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Your heart is a liar, boy. Your heart is corrupted by Western ideas, by the poison of thinking that mercy can exist without justice, that love can exist without submission to Allah's clear commands." He made me stand in the center of the room while he recited verse after verse about obedience, about the danger of following one's desires over divine instruction. "The heart that questions Allah's wisdom is a heart that has already chosen rebellion," he said. "And rebellion, even in thought, leads only to the fire." I felt tears starting in my eyes, but I blinked them back. Crying would only prove his point about my weakness. From that day forward, I learned to keep my questions locked away, buried so deep that sometimes I forgot they existed. But they were still there, like seeds in winter soil, waiting for the right conditions to grow. 20 years passed. I married Fatima, a gentle woman from a good family who asked few questions and supported my calling without reservation. We had a son, Omar, who grew up in the same marble halls where I had learned to hide my uncertainties. I stepped into my father's role as naturally as putting on an old coat, leading prayers, teaching classes, performing marriages and funerals, with the authority that comes from absolute certainty. But the certainty was a performance, even to myself. In the quiet hours after the last evening prayer, when the mosque was empty except for shadows and echoing silence, I would sit alone in the mihrab and feel the weight of all those unasked questions pressing against my chest. The verses I had memorized as a child now felt like chains around my thoughts. Beautiful chains, perhaps, but chains nonetheless. I began to notice things that disturbed me. The fear in young men's eyes when they asked about salvation, not reverence, but terror. The way women lowered their gaze, not out of modesty, but from shame they had been taught to carry. The hatred that crept into voices when we spoke of those outside our faith, as if their very existence was an insult to Allah. Was this what submission to God was supposed to feel like? This constant anxiety, this rigid separation between us and them. Late one night, unable to sleep, I found myself searching online for translations of our holy book in different languages. I told myself I was simply comparing interpretations, ensuring accuracy in my teaching. But really, I was looking for something I couldn't name. Some version of the truth that made sense of the love I felt in my heart alongside the judgment I was supposed to preach. That's when I first read the Christian scriptures in Arabic. I told myself it was for apologetic purposes, to better understand what we were arguing against. But as I read the words attributed to Jesus about loving enemies, about forgiveness, about God's desire to save rather than condemn, something deep inside me began to crack open. These weren't the words of a mere prophet. They were the words of someone who claimed to be the very heart of God made visible. I closed the laptop and went to perform my ablutions, trying to wash away the confusion with ritual cleanliness. But the words followed me. "Come unto me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Rest. When had I last felt rest in my faith? When had submission felt like peace rather than endless striving to be worthy of a love that always seemed just out of reach? The first sign of trouble came from my own son. Omar was 17, smart and observant in ways that both filled me with pride and kept me awake at night. He had inherited my tendency to notice things others preferred to ignore, but unlike me, he hadn't yet learned to keep his observations to himself. "Baba," he said one evening as we walked home from the mosque together, "why do we pray for Allah to guide the unbelievers, but then speak about them as if they're already condemned?" His question hit me like a stone to the chest, because it was the same question I had been wrestling with for months. I gave him the standard answer about Allah's wisdom being beyond human understanding, but I could see in his eyes that he wasn't satisfied. Worse, I could see that he had inherited my gift for seeing through comfortable lies. Word began to spread that the Imam's family was asking difficult questions. In a community where faith was supposed to be as solid and unchanging as the marble beneath our feet, questions were not curiosity, but symptoms of spiritual disease. Brother Mahmoud, who had been my closest friend since childhood, began watching me with suspicious eyes. "Some are saying you've been reading things you shouldn't read," he told me after prayer one Friday. "Books that plant seeds of doubt in fertile minds." The elders called a meeting. I sat in the same room where Sheikh Ahmad had once broken my spirit with his certainty, facing men whose faces I had known my entire life. They spoke carefully, diplomatically, but their message was clear. There had been reports of unusual behavior, of strange questions being asked, of young people leaving their gatherings with more doubts than answers. "We're not accusing," said Elder Hassan, his voice like silk wrapped around a blade. "We're simply concerned for your spiritual well-being." That night, I found Omar searching through my phone. His face was pale, his hands shaking slightly, as he scrolled through browser history I thought I had deleted. "Baba," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I found the Christian website, the one where you've been reading about." He couldn't even say the name. "About Isa. Why, Baba? Why would you read their lies about our prophet?" I couldn't answer him because I didn't have an answer that wouldn't shatter both our worlds. How could I tell my son that those lies felt more true than anything I had preached in 20 years? How could I explain that the Jesus I was reading about wasn't contradicting the God I had always believed in, but revealing him more clearly than I had ever seen before? The walls were closing in. I could feel the community's trust slipping away like sand through my fingers. Everything I had built, everything I was, hung in the balance of questions I could no longer contain. The confrontation came on a Thursday evening. The elders had requested my presence in the mosque after the final prayer, but when I arrived, I found not just the usual council, but representatives from the regional religious authority. They sat in a semicircle facing the single chair they had placed for me, their expressions grave as undertakers. "Sit," Elder Hassan said, his voice stripped of the warmth he had always shown me. I sat, feeling like a child again, like the boy who had once trembled before Sheikh Ahmad's righteous anger. But this was worse, because these men had watched me grow up, had celebrated my wedding, had prayed over my son when he was born. "We have received reports," began the regional representative, a thin man with a carefully groomed beard and eyes like winter. "Reports of deviation from established doctrine, of inappropriate curiosity about false teachings, of questions that undermine the faith of the young." He opened a folder and pulled out printed pages, screenshots from my internet searches, copies of downloads I thought had been private. The evidence was damning because it was true. There were my searches for Christian apologetics, my downloads of gospel translations, my visits to forums where former Muslims discussed their spiritual journeys. Seeing it all laid out like that, in black and white, made it seem more real and more dangerous than it had ever felt in the privacy of my midnight questioning. "What is your explanation for this?" Elder Hassan asked, and I could hear in his voice the hope that I would have some reasonable excuse, some innocent explanation that would allow us all to pretend this had never happened. I opened my mouth to lie, to fabricate some story about apologetic research or academic curiosity. The words were right there, ready to spill out and save my reputation, my position, my family's place in the community. But as I looked around that circle of faces, men I had known my entire life, men who had trusted me with their spiritual welfare, I found I couldn't do it. "I have questions," I said simply. "Questions about mercy, about love, about whether God's heart breaks for those who don't know Him or burns with anger against them." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. The meeting ended with a suspension. Temporary, they said, pending further investigation and a demonstration of renewed commitment to orthodox belief. I walked home through streets that felt foreign, despite being the same paths I had traveled for 40 years. Every shadow seemed to whisper accusations. Every familiar landmark reminded me of what I was losing. That night, as I lay in bed, listening to Fatima's worried breathing beside me, I felt my chest begin to tighten. The pressure started small, like a fist slowly closing around my heart. I tried to breathe deeply, to calm myself with prayer, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, all I could think about was Jesus in the garden, sweating drops of blood as he faced his own moment of ultimate choice. The pain exploded across my chest like lightning. I tried to call out, but no sound came. The last thing I remembered was hitting the floor of our hallway, Fatima's scream echoing in my ears, and thinking, "I'm not ready. God help me. I'm not ready." The darkness came not as sleep, but as burial. The weight of earth pressing down on consciousness, suffocating every breath I had never taken, crushing every prayer I had never truly meant. I felt my body far below, a distant thing surrounded by frantic voices and mechanical beeping. But I was somewhere else entirely, somewhere that existed outside the boundaries of time and physical space, in a realm where thought became reality and reality became judgment. The cold was the first thing I noticed, not the absence of warmth, but the presence of something actively malevolent, something that sought to drain not just heat from my being, but hope itself. It crept through whatever passed for my spiritual form in this place, seeping into what felt like bones I no longer possessed, freezing blood that no longer flowed. This was not the peaceful rest I had imagined death might bring, but something far more terrifying, a wakefulness more complete and awful than any I had ever experienced in life. Then came the voices. They started as whispers at the edges of perception, barely audible murmurs that seemed to emanate from the darkness itself. But they grew stronger, more insistent, until they became a chorus of condemnation that surrounded me on all sides. These were not the voices of demons or evil spirits as I might have expected, but something far worse. They were the voices of truth, speaking with absolute authority about every failure, every moment of doubt, every secret rebellion of my heart. "You doubted," they hissed, each word carrying the weight of cosmic law. "You questioned what was given to you as sacred truth. You sought answers in forbidden places, read forbidden words, entertained forbidden thoughts." Each accusation hit me like a physical blow because every single one was undeniably accurate. There was no defense I could offer, no justification I could present, because in this place all pretense was stripped away. The voices continued their relentless assault. You wore the robes of righteousness while harboring seeds of apostasy. You led prayers while your heart wandered toward other gods. You taught children about submission while secretly questioning the very foundations of faith. You built your reputation on certainty while your soul was drowning in doubt. I tried to speak, to defend myself, to explain that my questions had come from love rather than rebellion, that I had wanted to understand God better, not reject Him. But my words fell into the darkness like stones into a bottomless well, making no sound, creating no echo. The acoustics of this place seemed designed to swallow hope and amplify condemnation. The worst part was not their anger, but their accuracy. Every secret doubt I had carried for 40 years, every midnight moment of questioning, every time I had felt my heart pull toward something my mind rejected. It was all laid bare in this place where nothing could be hidden. I saw myself as I truly was, not the faithful imam the community believed me to be, but a man who had spent decades living a lie, even to himself. Memories began flooding back with painful clarity. Moments I had forgotten or chosen to suppress. The night I had first wondered if God's love could really be conditional on perfect theological understanding. The morning I had looked at my sleeping son and wondered what kind of God would condemn a child for believing the wrong things about Jesus. The afternoon I had comforted a grieving mother and felt in my heart that no truly loving father would torture his children for eternity, no matter what they believed. I called out to Allah, using every name I had memorized over decades of study. Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, Al-Ghafur, Ar-Rauf, most gracious, most merciful, most forgiving, most kind. I recited every verse about His mercy and compassion that I could remember, pleading for the intervention of the God I had served faithfully for 40 years. "Where are you?" I cried into the void. I never missed a prayer, never broke a fast, never failed to lead your people in worship. Why do you not answer? But there was only silence, not the peaceful silence of contemplation, but the terrible silence of abandonment. It was as if every prayer I had ever offered had been thrown back at me, marked "Return to sender." The God I thought I knew, the God I had built my entire life around, seemed as distant and unreachable as the stars I could no longer see. Time moved differently in that place. Minutes felt like years, seconds stretched into centuries of isolation and regret. I began to understand what the mystics meant when they wrote about the dark night of the soul. That terrible moment when everything you thought you knew about God falls away, leaving you naked and shivering in the cold reality of your own spiritual poverty. The darkness seemed to press closer, becoming more substantial, more oppressive. I could feel it entering through my pores, filling my lungs, replacing whatever passed for air in this realm with something thick and suffocating. The voices grew louder, more insistent, repeating my failures like a broken record that would never stop playing. Just when I thought the darkness would consume me entirely, just when I was ready to accept that I was truly lost, beyond any hope of redemption, something changed. It started as the faintest hint of warmth in the distance, so subtle I thought I might be imagining it. But it grew steadily stronger, and with it came a sensation I had never experienced in 40 years of religious devotion. Complete, unconditional acceptance. Light began to appear. Not the harsh fluorescent brightness of hospital corridors, not the flickering flame of oil lamps in mosque prayer halls, but something entirely different. It was warm, golden, alive, with a presence that made my soul recognize home before my mind could understand what it was seeing. The light seemed to have texture, weight, personality, as if it were not merely illumination, but love itself made visible. As the light grew brighter, the voices of accusation began to fade. They didn't argue with the approaching radiance or fight against it. They simply melted away like darkness always does in the presence of true light. The cold that had been penetrating my very essence was replaced by warmth that seemed to flow from the light source directly into whatever passed for my heart in this place. Through that radiance, a figure began to emerge. At first, just a silhouette, then becoming clearer with each step he took toward me. I expected many things. Perhaps an angel, perhaps some manifestation of divine judgment, perhaps nothing at all but my own desperate imagination creating comfort in the face of damnation. What I did not expect was the face I saw. When the figure finally stood before me, radiating love so pure and complete that it made every fear I had ever carried simply evaporate. I knew that face. I had seen it in my dreams, glimpsed it in moments of deepest prayer, felt its presence in every question my heart had asked that my mind had refused to acknowledge. This was Isa, Jesus, but not the diminished prophet I had been taught about. This was the one my heart had been seeking all along, the missing piece that would make sense of everything I had never understood about God's love. He approached with the unhurried grace of someone who has all of eternity and chooses to spend it walking toward one broken soul. Each step seemed to bring more light into that place of shadows, more warmth into that realm of cold, more hope into that space of despair. There was no hurry in his movement, no urgency born of limited time, but rather the patient pace of perfect love that knows its presence alone can heal what has been torn apart. His face, as it became clearer in the growing light, held expressions I had never seen combined in a single human countenance. Infinite compassion mixed with absolute authority, tender mercy blended with unwavering strength, perfect understanding, coupled with complete acceptance. This was not the face of a mere prophet, not the features of just another messenger, but the very image of God's heart made visible to human eyes. "My beloved Son," he said, and his voice was like everything I had ever hoped prayer could be. Intimate yet majestic, personal yet cosmic, completely present yet echoing with eternal authority. The Arabic I had used for decades in formal religious recitation seemed suddenly inadequate, replaced by a communication that bypassed language entirely and spoke directly from heart to heart. There was no triumph in his expression as he looked at me, no "I told you so" satisfaction at my lifelong theological error. Instead, his face held the kind of tender sadness you see in a father's eyes when his prodigal child finally stumbles home after years of wandering in far countries, battered and broken, but still beloved, still welcomed, still celebrated, despite the long journey through darkness. "You have been carrying such a heavy burden for so long," he continued, stepping closer until I could see the depths of love written in every line of his face, carved into every gentle expression. The weight of trying to earn what was always freely given, the exhaustion of performing righteousness instead of receiving it, the loneliness of seeking approval from a God you thought was perpetually disappointed in you. I wanted to prostrate myself as I had done thousands of times in the mosque, to perform the familiar ritual of submission that had defined my spiritual life for 4 decades. My body, or whatever passed for my body in this place, instinctively moved toward the posture of worship I had learned as a child. But somehow I knew that what he wanted was not my religious performance, but my authentic presence, not my practiced humility, but my genuine heart. Instead of falling to my knees, I found myself standing straighter, looking directly into eyes that held depths of love I had never imagined possible. These were not the eyes of a judge waiting to pronounce sentence, not the gaze of a disappointed authority figure cataloging my failures, but the eyes of someone who had been waiting patiently for this moment of recognition, this instant of true seeing. "I know you expected to meet Allah," he continued, his voice carrying both infinite gentleness and absolute certainty. "And you have. I am not separate from the Father you have worshipped all these years. I am the Father's love made visible, his mercy given human form, his heart walking among his children to show them what perfect love looks like in flesh and blood." The theological implications should have shattered my worldview, should have sent me into crisis over decades of teaching and believing what now seemed like partial truth. Instead, I felt the most profound relief I have ever experienced. It was like carrying a massive weight for so long that you forget how heavy it is, then suddenly having someone not just help you carry it, but take it away entirely. "Every time you prayed to him in sincerity," he continued, "you were praying to me. Every time you sought his face in the darkness of your doubts, you were seeking mine. Every moment when your heart cried out for mercy and love and understanding, you were crying out to me, and I heard every word, felt every tear, knew every desperate longing of your soul. The pieces of the puzzle I had been struggling to fit together my entire life, God's justice and mercy, his transcendence and immanence, his holiness and his love, his desire for obedience and his heart for the lost, suddenly clicked into perfect alignment. The contradictions that had tormented me, the paradoxes that had kept me awake at night, the theological knots I could never untangle, they all resolved in the presence of this one who was somehow both fully divine and completely approachable. He raised his hand slowly, deliberately, with the careful movement of someone who knows that what he is about to do will change everything. As his fingers approached my chest, I could feel power radiating from them, not the crushing force of divine judgment I had always feared, but the gentle, irresistible strength of perfect love. The moment his hand made contact with my heart, everything changed. The darkness that had surrounded us vanished like smoke in a hurricane. The cold that had been seeping into my very essence was replaced by warmth that seemed to flow from his touch directly into my soul. But more than that, I could feel my physical heart, far away in that hospital room, responding to his presence here in this place beyond time and space. "Feel that?" he asked, his hand still resting over my heart. "That's not just spiritual healing. That's your physical heart remembering how to beat properly, your damaged muscle regenerating, your blocked arteries clearing. The doctors will call it a medical miracle, but you and I know the truth. There are no merely medical miracles, only moments when heaven touches earth and things are made whole. Through his touch, I began to understand things that no amount of theological study had ever revealed. I saw how every act of genuine love I had ever witnessed was his love working through human hearts. I saw how every moment of true peace I had ever experienced was a glimpse of his presence. I saw how every question I had ever asked about God's character was actually his Spirit guiding me toward a fuller understanding of who he really is. The mercy you longed to preach but felt forbidden to emphasize, he continued. That was my heart breaking through your theological constraints. The love you wanted to offer but were told was too lenient. That was my nature asserting itself, despite everything you had been taught to suppress it. The questions that made others suspicious were actually my voice calling you to deeper truth. I felt tears streaming down my face, though I wasn't sure how tears were possible in this realm beyond physical form. They felt like liquid relief, like decades of pent-up longing finally finding release. "Forgive me," I whispered. "Forgive me for denying who you are. Forgive me for teaching others to see you as less than you are. Forgive me for all the years I spent building walls between your love and the hearts of those who needed it most." His smile was like watching the sun rise over the Mediterranean, like seeing the first flowers of spring after the longest winter, like hearing your child's first word or feeling rain after years of drought. "There is nothing to forgive," he said. "You see me clearly now, and that erases everything that came before. Your heart always knew the truth. Now your mind can catch up." Through his ongoing touch, visions began flooding my consciousness, not of judgment or condemnation, but of possibility and hope. I saw my former students, the young men I had taught in the mosque, and I could see the questions hidden in their hearts, the same longings I had carried, the same search for a God who was truly loving, rather than merely demanding. I saw my wife, my son, my community, and I could feel his heart breaking for them, not with anger, but with the desperate love of someone who wants to gather all his children close, but will not force them to come. "I have work for you to do," he said, his voice taking on a tone of gentle authority. "Not the work of religious performance or theological argument, but the work of love, sharing what you have received, offering what has been given to you, being a bridge between two worlds that have been kept apart by fear and misunderstanding." I could have stayed in that moment forever, basking in the reality of perfect love, perfect understanding, perfect acceptance. The thought of returning to the world of confusion, fear, and religious performance was almost unbearable. But as he began to step back, his hand lifting from my chest, I understood that this encounter was not an escape from my life, but an empowerment for it. "Don't leave me," I pleaded, feeling panic rise as the distance between us increased. "Let me stay here with you. I don't want to face the questions, the accusations, the loneliness of being the only one who knows the truth." His expression grew infinitely tender, the look of a parent who must send a beloved child into the world for their own good and the good of others. "You will never be alone again," he promised. My spirit goes with you. My love surrounds you. My truth lives in your heart now. And there are others, more than you know, who are asking the same questions you asked, feeling the same doubts you felt, longing for the same love you have found. The light around him began to intensify, and I felt myself being pulled away, back toward my body, back toward the world of machines and medical procedures. But his presence went with me. His love wrapped around me like a warm cloak. His truth settled into my heart, like a seed that would never stop growing. His last words followed me like an echo that would resonate through every remaining day of my life. Tell them I came not to condemn, but to save. Tell them I am not angry with their questions. I am the answer they're looking for. Tell them that every heart that seeks me will find me, because I have been seeking them far longer than they have been seeking me. I opened my eyes to fluorescent lights and the smell of disinfectant that characterizes hospitals everywhere. That peculiar blend of cleaning chemicals and human hope that permeates places where life and death wage their daily battles. The heart monitor beside my bed was beeping steadily now, no longer screaming the alarm of impending death, its rhythmic sound almost musical, after the profound silence I had experienced in that other realm. A young nurse was checking my IV line, her movements efficient and practiced. When she saw my eyes open, her face lit up with genuine relief. Not the professional pleasantness of medical training, but the authentic joy of someone who had witnessed something extraordinary. "You're awake," she said, quickly pressing the call button. "We were so worried. You've been unconscious for 3 days. Your family hasn't left the hospital. The doctor said what happened to you doesn't make medical sense." Doctor Mansouri arrived within minutes, examining my chart with the thoroughness of someone who had learned not to trust first impressions. "You gave us quite a scare," he said, his voice carrying professional experience mixed with genuine puzzlement. "Your heart stopped for nearly 4 minutes. We had to use the paddles twice to get you back. By all medical logic, you should have significant brain damage from the lack of oxygen. Instead, your cognitive functions appear completely normal. Your heart rhythm is stronger than it's been in years." He paused, pulling up my latest test results. "It's unprecedented in my experience. In 30 years of practice, I've seen maybe 3 cases like this. We're calling it a miracle of modern medicine, but between you and me, I'm not sure modern medicine had much to do with it." I nodded and said nothing. How could I explain that while my body was dying on their table, I had been more alive than ever before? How could I tell this good doctor that the hands that had restarted my heart were not his, but those of the one I had spent 40 years misunderstanding? The first 3 days after waking, I spoke to no one about what had happened. The silence felt necessary, protective. Fatima sat beside my bed for hours, holding my hand and reading Quranic verses she hoped would comfort me, her worry evident in every careful word she chose. Omar brought me books on Islamic healing and recovery, his young face serious with concern for his father's spiritual well-being. Everyone was so kind, so concerned for my physical recovery, but none of them could see that the man who had collapsed in his hallway was not the same one lying in this hospital bed. I felt like a traveler who had visited a foreign country and returned home to find that nothing looked familiar anymore, that the landscape of his former life had been irrevocably changed. On the fourth day, everything changed again. A young Christian nurse accidentally left her phone playing soft worship music while she checked my vitals. The melody drifted through the room. Something about being saved by grace, about love that never lets go. The words were in English, but the message transcended language, speaking directly to the place in my heart that had been touched by divine love. I found myself crying, not from sadness, but from recognition. This was the love I had felt in the light. This was the voice that had spoken my name in the darkness. The tears came in waves, each one carrying away another layer of the fear and confusion I had carried for so long. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, reaching for her phone with embarrassed haste. "I didn't mean to disturb you with my music. I know you're Muslim, and I should have been more considerate. Please don't report me. I really need this job." "Wait," I said, surprising us both with the urgency in my voice. "Please, don't turn it off. What was that song about?" She looked uncertain, probably wondering if this was some kind of test. "It's about Jesus," she said carefully, "about how he loves us even when we can't love ourselves, how he reaches for us even when we're running away." The name hit me like lightning. Jesus. Isa. The one who had touched my heart and brought me back from the edge of eternity. I closed my eyes and saw again that face full of compassion, felt again that hand on my chest. "He was there," I whispered, not caring how crazy it sounded. "When I died, he was there. It was Jesus. He touched me, and I came back. He spoke to me, and I'm not the same." Her eyes filled with tears. "I believe you," she said simply. "He has a way of showing up when we need him most. 3 years ago, I was in a car accident, unconscious for 2 days. While I was out, I met him too. He told me I still had work to do. For the first time since waking up, I didn't feel alone. Someone believed my impossible story because they knew the impossible God who had made it true. We talked for the next hour, carefully, quietly, aware that we were treading on sacred ground. She told me about her own encounter, about how Jesus had appeared to her in a place beyond dreams. "What do I do now?" I asked as her shift was ending. "How do I live with this truth when everyone around me would see it as betrayal?" She squeezed my hand gently. "You live one day at a time," she said. "You let him guide you. You trust that the same love that brought you back will show you the way forward." That night, alone in the darkness of my hospital room, I felt more awake than I had in years. The encounter hadn't been a dream or hallucination. It had been the most real thing that had ever happened to me. Now I had to figure out how to live in a world where that reality would be seen as impossible by almost everyone I knew and loved. I was discharged after a week with a clean bill of health and a prescription for heart medication the doctors insisted I take, despite my cardiovascular system now functioning better than it had in decades. They called it a miracle of modern medicine. I called it a miracle of divine intervention. We were both right in our own ways. The first thing I did when I got home was find an Arabic translation of the New Testament. I told Fatima I was researching for apologetic purposes, preparing to counter Christian arguments more effectively. She seemed relieved that I was taking such a scholarly approach. If only she knew how hungry I was to hear again the voice that had spoken to me in the light. I read the Gospels like a man dying of thirst drinks water, each word resonating with the memory of that encounter, each teaching of Jesus echoing the voice I had heard when he touched my heart. The Sermon on the Mount, the parables of mercy, the declarations of love for enemies. This was the same heart I had felt beating in that place beyond death. But it was the story of his crucifixion and resurrection that broke me completely open. As I read about his death, I remembered the love in his eyes. As he looked at me in that realm between life and death, he had died for this moment, not just for humanity in general, but for me specifically, for the Imam who had spent 40 years denying his true identity, while secretly longing for the very love he offered. I wept as I read about Thomas, the disciple who wouldn't believe until he could touch the wounds in Jesus' hands. I understood his doubt because I had lived it, breathed it, preached around it for decades. But I also understood his declaration when he finally saw, "My Lord and my God." That's exactly what had torn from my heart when I recognized who was standing in the light. The story of Paul's conversion particularly gripped me. Here was a man who had persecuted Christians out of genuine religious conviction, believing he was serving God by opposing those who proclaimed Jesus as Lord. Yet Jesus had appeared to him, not with condemnation, but with love. Paul's entire worldview had been overturned in a single encounter, just as mine had been. Night after night, I stayed awake, reading, cross-referencing, comparing the Jesus of the Gospels with the one I had met in that place beyond time. Every word he had spoken there aligned perfectly with the teachings recorded in these pages. The mercy he had shown me was the same mercy he had extended to tax collectors and sinners. The love that had flooded my heart was the same love that had driven him to the cross. That night, alone in my study while my family slept, I did something I had never done in 40 years of religious leadership. I prayed without formula, without ritual cleansing, without facing Mecca, without any of the prescribed forms that had structured my spiritual life since childhood. I simply spoke from my heart to the one who had revealed himself to be my heart's true home. "Jesus," I said, and saying his name out loud felt like breathing after being underwater for decades. "I know who you are now. I know you're not just a prophet, not just a good teacher, not just another messenger. You are God with us, God for us, God touching us when we're too broken to reach for him ourselves." The words poured out of me like water from a broken dam. 40 years of suppressed questions, hidden doubts, secret longings, finally finding voice. I confessed everything. The years of teaching others to diminish him, when my heart suspected he was far greater than I was allowed to say. The fear that had kept me from exploring the questions he had placed in my heart. The pride that had made me think I could build a relationship with God on my own religious achievements. "I don't know what comes next," I admitted, feeling his presence fill the room as surely as if he were standing there in physical form. "I don't know how to tell my family, my community, anyone who knows me. I don't know how to reconcile 40 years of teaching one thing with the truth you've shown me, but I can't pretend anymore." As I prayed, memories began flooding back. Moments throughout my life when I had felt his presence without recognizing it. The night Omar was born, when I had held my newborn son and felt overwhelmed by a love so pure it seemed to come from beyond myself. The morning I had comforted a grieving widow and found words of hope I hadn't planned to speak. The countless times I had stood before my congregation and felt moved to emphasize God's mercy rather than His judgment. He had been there all along, working through my life even when I didn't know His true name, drawing me slowly but surely toward the moment when I would be ready to see Him clearly. Every question that had troubled me, every doubt that had made others suspicious, every longing for a more loving God, they had all been His voice calling me home. "I'm yours now," I said finally, the words carrying the weight of complete surrender. "Completely yours, no matter what it costs. Use me however you want. I don't need to be an imam anymore. I just need to be yours." The peace that filled me then was the same peace I had felt when He touched my heart in that place beyond death. It was the peace that passes understanding, the rest that comes only to those who stop trying to earn love and simply receive it. For the first time in my life, I felt spiritually complete, no longer striving to bridge the gap between myself and God, but resting in the truth that He had bridged it Himself. Over the following weeks, I began to understand that my encounter with Jesus wasn't just a personal salvation experience. It was preparation for a new kind of ministry. Not the ministry of religious authority I had known as an imam, but the ministry of witness, of sharing what I had received. Former students began reaching out, sensing something different in me. "Sheikh," one wrote, "there's something changed about you since your heart attack. You seem more peaceful. What happened?" Another called to say, "I've been having dreams about Jesus. What do you think it means?" I realized that my years of questions, of wrestling with doubts, hadn't been wasted. They had been preparation for this moment when I could offer hope to others walking the same difficult path. The transformation wasn't complete overnight, but every day brought new glimpses of the life He was calling me toward. I left the clinic carrying a heart that felt younger than my son, yet every stone of the old quarter looked older, as if the streets had aged while I floated in that corridor of light. News traveled faster than blood. Within days, the mosque council sent a courteous dismissal. My tenure ended for theological irregularities. Paper cannot wound a man who has heard his name spoken in glory, but the silence of friends pierced deeper than any decree. Phones that once hummed with prayers now lay dark like unplugged lamps. At home, Fatima traced the scar across my chest like a cartographer mapping an undiscovered coast. I told her everything, the frozen void, the accusing chorus, the hand radiant with gentle power. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not from fear, but recognition. She whispered that for weeks a man in white had appeared in her dreams, bidding her take courage, because love would soon rewrite our story. We held each other until the dawn call drifted through the shutters, sounding less like a law and more like a lullaby remembering itself. Omar resisted with the zeal of youth. He pinned verses to his wall, rehearsed arguments he had learned at my feet, and refused to meet my gaze. I answered every challenge with smaller acts, mending his frayed backpack, brewing mint tea exactly how his mother does, praying softly where he could overhear. One sunset, he asked to walk. Beneath clouds bruised violet, he confessed. The warmth I felt when you led prayers is in you again, but different. Can a book explain that? We began John's Gospel side by side, and I watched hope flicker behind his guarded eyes. Former students arrived in secret, carrying notebooks stuffed with questions they had never dared to voice. In our kitchen, we read about a shepherd who leaves 99 to go after one, and grown men wept into their coffee. My lost pulpit had merely moved. Canvas walls replaced marble, yet hearts proved wider than any sanctuary I once managed. Each testimony spread like wind in dry grass. What officials denounced as betrayal, others recognized as life. We eventually left the country at night, taking only clothes, photographs, and the memory of a voice that cannot be silenced. In a small coastal city, I was given a new name and a community that sings with its windows open. Here my scar is an introduction, my story a key. I speak in living rooms, online rooms, anywhere ears are tired of condemnation. I tell them fear ends where perfect love enters, and that love has a name. If your heart still beats while you read this, you are not forgotten. Breathe his name. Even a broken whisper will reach him, and let him script fresh sentences across the pages of your life. He turned my collapse into a beginning. He can do the same for you. Come.